The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Dealing with the Inner Witness of the Holy Spirit. One of the most common questions I get is, when are you going to debate William Lane Craig? Well, I don't know that that's ever going to happen. And I completely understand Dr. Craig has his own criteria for determining who he's going to debate and who he's not going to debate. That's not what this is about. There is an unfair criticism of Dr. Craig that I've heard many times, and I've addressed a few times. I'm going to go into it in slightly better detail today. Not so much the criticism that's addressed to him, but the foundation itself. The criticism is that he has said on many occasions that he is convinced there is a God because of the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. And the criticism of that is that he doesn't defend this inner witness of the Holy Spirit in debates. Instead, he'll present the Kalam cosmological argument or his moral argument, etc. This is an unfair criticism. If, for example, you were convinced for a reason that you couldn't actually demonstrate to somebody else, and yet you needed to find, you knew you were correct and you needed to find a way to convince them, finding arguments and evidence that you were convinced were consistent with your view is not a problem. Hopefully it's not too abstract. This idea about the inner witness of the Holy Spirit is essentially, it's been called the sesus divinitatis in some forms. Essentially, God is directly revealing to these individuals the truth of his existence in a way that is personal, that is experiential. And in philosophical circles, sometimes they would try to claim that this sense is properly basic, that it not only could not be externally justified, but that it requires no justification. And what you'll find is the arguments for this divine sense are peculiar. And normally, I would say, fairly unconvincing to those who haven't had a similar experience. Whether or not they should be convincing to those who have had a similar experience is something we'll talk about. But if Craig is convinced because God has directly revealed himself to him, it's not dishonest of him to present other arguments, because he recognizes that this personal experience that he's had, while it may or may not be sufficient warrant for his belief, it's certainly not going to do anything to convince you or me. If your mom comes to you and says, "Last night your grandmother's ghost came to me while I was sitting in my room. I can't prove that to you, but let me all talk about this piece of evidence about souls and this piece of evidence about past lives, regressions, and this near-death experience, and put together all this package of things that I think are consistent with my ghost story." That's at least an attempt to argue from a foundation that would be accessible to you. To just come to you and say, "You need to believe me because this is what I'm saying happened to me." We can't work that way. And this is something, as I've referenced before from David Hume, that revelation is necessarily first person, and to everybody else it's hearsay. So my personal experience, whether it's with a ghost, a demon, or the God of the universe, can't ever be anything than an anecdotal story for you. So let's take a look at what we're dealing with when people talk about this divine sense, this internal revelation from the Holy Spirit, and how it relates to the conversations that we might have about whether or not there's a God. I'd argue probably that the biggest problem with the divine sense, with the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, with this appeal to personal experience, is that it's ultimately unfalsifiable. There's no way to prove somebody wrong, which makes it untestable. It's not merely untestable in the sense that I can't go back in time and I can't experience what you experience. It's untestable in essentially every single aspect. The problem is that as human beings, we generally rely on our direct experiences. I know what I know. I know what I saw. I know exactly what I saw. You couldn't possibly convince me that I didn't see what I think I saw. And we say and do this even with the full recognition that we know our senses can be deceived. We know that sometimes we can be absolutely just cocksure that we saw what we saw, and then somebody demonstrates that we didn't see what we thought we saw. We know that magicians and con artists fool us all the time by making use of the thought processes that we use to discern reality and abusing them to make you think you see something that you didn't see. There have been a number of calls to the atheist experience over the years and emails from people who will say something like, oh, I was asleep in bed and I woke up and I saw this, or I had this experience, or I had this feeling, and blah, blah, blah. How do you explain that? Now, by and large, my response is, I don't have an explanation for that. It's not even something I can actually investigate. I can talk to you about things that we know to be true about reality. We can talk about, various brain states and being partially awake, lucid dreaming. We can talk about all these things, which is why now when you hear the stories, in some cases they'll say, I sat up bolt right in bed and, I was awake, I was no longer dreaming. They want to cut off all these avenues of other explanations. And they could in fact be correct. If you tell me that, you had an experience with a ghost, I'm going to probably say the same thing to all of you. I am happy to accept that you had some experience. I'm just not happy to accept your proposed explanation for that experience. I don't know how one could think that one could be justified in believing this proposed explanation when there's no way to investigate. And by that, I mean, you may have had the experience, but there's no way for you to confirm that what you think about the experience is accurate. There's no way for you to test that. And you fundamentally know that there's no way for somebody else to test it or verify it. This comes up a lot, not just with the divine sense that some people say they have about God or the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. All of these things are the same. Anything that falls into the realm of the supernatural, and we're talking about whether or not it can hypothetically be tested. Look at the James Randi Educational Foundation testing all sorts of claims about the paranormal. And one of the things that Randi was very clear about that helped form my take on skepticism is that it's not about debunking. We're not about trying to prove you wrong. It's about attempting to confirm and either confirming or failing to confirm. And that this raises a problem. So let's say you have somebody come in who claims that they're a dowser and they can find, using a couple of sticks, water or gold. And you construct the test and they fail. What have you learned? Well, you've learned that on this day, in this way, under these test conditions, this individual can't do what they claim they could do, or were at least unable to do what they claimed they could do. That doesn't mean that they can't do it some other time, some other way. It doesn't mean that somebody else can't do it. You haven't disproven dowsing. Similarly, when somebody talks about the internal witness of the Holy Spirit, that is a claim that I can't test. It's a claim that apparently nobody can test. It's a claim that they can't test. And that's the problem that we're going to come back to in a moment. But to stay with the skepticism thing for a moment, let's imagine that you think you have a spirit from the other side who's able to communicate with you. And we want to find out whether or not that's real. Okay. If you ask people to propose different tests for that, they often will go to, well, this spirit should be able to communicate something that I wouldn't know. And for the sake of argument, even though I don't have my wallet here, let's just imagine that your ghost friend told you that I have $236 in my wallet. And then we open up my wallet and we find out that I have $17 in my wallet. What have we learned? Not much. See, there's a tree structure that you could potentially use to look at this. Either there's a spirit or there's not. If there's not, we're done. Because clearly if there's not, then there's no spirit to tell you what's in my wallet. Boom, boom, boom. Let's say there is a spirit. Now you have this issue of, does the spirit actually know what's in my wallet? Well, if it doesn't, then it can't communicate that to you. It can guess. Maybe its guesses will be better than yours. Maybe it wouldn't. But let's go right down the line and give it the benefit of the doubt. Let's say there is a spirit who absolutely can know what money is in my wallet. This spirit is able to communicate with you. And this spirit is honest and will tell you the truth. Under those conditions, if it tells you that I have $432 in my wallet and I have 17, what can we conclude? Well, I mean, we've said for the sake of argument, it exists, it knows, it tells the truth, and it communicates with you, boom, boom, boom. So clearly, under that hypothetical, we couldn't reasonably conclude that the spirit doesn't exist. The conclusion would be that you made an error, that you misunderstood the information it was relaying to you, that maybe it was talking in a different base of numbers than you were understanding, or a language that you didn't fully understand. Well, now let's address whether or not it's a perfect communicator, because now all of a sudden, as we move towards something that's a perfect communicator, as we move towards something that's more godlike, now all of a sudden, when your proposed quantity of money in my wallet doesn't match what's actually there, now we've got a problem, because we've constructed your source of information such that it knows and is perfect and is communicating, and you are now the only factor left, which means that there would have to be some mistake on your part. But if you have a perfect communicator communicating with you, and this is what it told you, provided you're not just lying about what it told you, now we can show that at least one of the assumptions in that chain can't be true, because it conflicts with what we can directly test and observe. But at the end of the day, what if you're right? What if you're convinced that there's a spirit that's telling you how much money's in my wallet, and it tells you I have $17, and we look and I have $17. Now what can we conclude? Can we conclude that you're right, that in fact there is some spirit and it's communicating with you and it knows how much money's in my wallet? No, because that's a single point of data that we would have to then repeat. We need to know with what kind of regularity can you accurately predict what money is in somebody's wallet. But until there's a way to demonstrate that this spirit, this apart from you, exists and is doing that, how do we rule out the idea that you have some way of finding out how much money is in my wallet? The fact that you got a positive result doesn't mean that your explanation for that result is true and accurate, even if that's honestly what you're convinced of. So we take that scenario and we apply it to a divine sense. When somebody talks about being convinced because of the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, what they're really saying is, there is a God who is perfect, who is relaying to me privately a truth which is inviolable, which I cannot justify, but I don't need to justify. It's intrinsic in the fact that this God is of perfect nature, that it could not be deceptive. And even if all that were to be the case, here's the problem. How do you know you're not mistaken? Oh, this gets back to conversations that I've had with debate opponents. How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? As long as there's a fallible human being in the mix, it could be that you're mistaken about this sense that you think you're feeling. That you are having some experience and you've become convinced that it is the result of a perfect being, that you couldn't be wrong about that because the being makes you incapable of being wrong about that. But that's a dishonest bait and switch, because you could be wrong. This is something that we know to be true about human beings. And in order for you to be justified in claiming that there's a being who could make it so that you are not wrong about this, you'd need to demonstrate that that being exists and that it is not only never wrong, but that it can make it so that you're not wrong about that. And how can you do that? There's a cascade here where the mere fact that we are fallible human beings means we can never reach the sort of absolute certainty about anything, let alone this one thing that you want to use to undergird all of your positions about a God. So when somebody like William Lane Craig defends on the basis of the Kalam cosmological argument, that's not them being dishonest. That's him recognizing that even though he may be convinced because of what he calls the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, he has no way of convincing anybody else of this. The one thing I'm not sure whether or not he realizes is that he cannot have sufficient evidentiary warrant to believe on that basis, because he has to recognize his own fallibility. In the same way that he's recognizing this information wouldn't be sufficient for anybody else, he should be able to recognize that this information should not be sufficient for him. Just because we don't lock people up in a rubber room for thinking that God is talking to them all the time, when we recognize delusions that are outside the realm of reality, the people are convinced that something is true when they can have no reason to do that, we don't lock them up until this is something where there's a demonstrated harm, where this delusion is so strong that their conflict with reality makes life essentially dangerous and unlivable. That's not the case with people who are convinced that God exists. By and large, the average person sitting in the pew who's convinced because they think the Holy Spirit talks to them isn't a danger to themselves and society in the same sense as someone who is undergoing psychiatric treatment or who is put in a facility for their own protection or to protect other people. Not all delusions are created equal. So when we're dealing with people who talk about how they are convinced based on the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, it's, for me, akin to them saying, I have a feeling and I'm confident that this feeling is right. That's it. That's what it is. I have a feeling and I'm confident that this feeling is right. Well, I'm not confident that your understanding, your explanation for that feeling is correct. The feeling is, I would say, the explanation. Essentially, I have a feeling that God is communicating to me. Okay. I understand that you feel that way. But not only will that never be enough to convince me, I don't see how it is enough to reasonably convince you. In fact, it seems to be a way of avoiding having to provide any justification for your beliefs. Because if what you're saying is essentially like, I've had this experience and so I know it's real, you might as well be looking at an optical illusion and saying, I know those two colors are the same, or I know those two tables are the same size, or I know those dots are moving because that's what I see. In those cases, we have something where we can show that what you see is not an accurate reflection of reality. But when you talk about this inner witness of the Holy Spirit, you are creating a scenario that can't be falsified. And that is a dangerous position to be in. If ever you are evaluating your belief and you are forced to recognize that this is an unfalsifiable position, you should give it up. It shouldn't even be, you don't have a choice about whether to give it up. But when you recognize that you believe something that is fundamentally unfalsifiable, and I'm talking about claims about the nature of reality, about what's real and what's not real, the proper exercise of critical thinking, of skepticism, is to recognize that you don't and could not have a good enough reason to be convinced of that. Not that you're wrong, not that there's not a God. But if you have this divine sense, if you feel that God is making his presence clear to you, maybe you should ask God to find a way to demonstrate to all of us that this divine sense, that this inner revelation of the Holy Spirit is distinctly different from I have a feeling and I'm confident that I'm right. Because as long as that's what it is, as long as it is essentially the blind faith sort of topic that we've talked about before, now you're forced to recognize that your reason for believing is fundamentally no better than anybody else who might give a similar reason for believing something that is in conflict with your beliefs. And as I've said before, there's no position you couldn't justify based on faith. And there's no position that you couldn't justify based on, this is the feeling that I have. I think it comes from God. God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. God's against gay marriage. This is the feeling I have. This is what the Holy Spirit's whispering in my ear. That sort of justification isn't justification. It's obfuscation. It's a way of hiding the fact that you have a position with no sound evidentiary warrant at all, but you want it to be respected, or you want it to be viewed as if you have a good reason when you don't.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.